All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to my presentation on well-being and basic needs. We are the UCSD Cross-Cultural Center. Before I begin with the presentation, I want to give a land acknowledgement. UCSD resides on unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. The UCSD community holds great respect for the land and the indigenous people that first resided where we are currently located. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that the Kumeyaay people continue to have political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge and continue to amplify and uplift the Kumeyaay Nation for their contributions to the UCSD community and the greater San Diego community. And this is adapted from the UCSD Intertribal Resource Center. Now I'm gonna give off an introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Leslie Santiago. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm double majoring in ethnic studies and public health, currently a fourth year, and I'm a social justice educator here at the Cross Cultural Center, as well as an outreach and engagement intern. To give a brief overview of what we're gonna talk about today. So first I'm gonna define some key terms that are relevant to this presentation. And then I'm going to get into the importance of basic needs. And then I'll talk a little bit about the impacts of not having your needs met and how that ties into health implications. And then we're going to talk about some solutions, most of them revolved around community care. And throughout this presentation, we're going to go over a lot of information. And these are some learning goals that I want you all to keep in mind while we're going through them. So the first one being understand the different components of well-being. The second one being understand how basic needs affects health. And the last one is learn the importance of community care. All right, we're going to start off with some key terms. Oh, so I'm first going to introduce a little activity. So I'm going to pose this question to y'all. What do you think well-being is? And I'm actually going to drop a link in the chat for this. It'll take you to a page. It's called Mentimeter. And you can go ahead and in a few words, or the first words that pop into your head when you think about well-being, if you could please share that with us. So for me, I think when I think of well-being, I think of health, I think of community, I think of safety. Let me know if y'all think of anything else or if anything else pops into y'all's heads. Physical and mental, of course. Yeah, there are different aspects of well-being, and we're actually going to touch upon that in a little bit. Happiness, comfort. Safe spaces, for sure. Peace. Yes, these are all different aspects and they're super important. Someone else dropped in the chat, effectively managing for health/chronic medical conditions and disabilities. Yeah, managing is a big part of it, and access to management as well. All right, thank you all for your participation. I'm gonna go back to the presentation, but if y'all still wanna drop words in the chat, that's appreciated. All right, so what is well-being? As many of you already touched upon in the Menti activity, well-being has a lot to do with being healthy, happy, and being comfortable. There are 4 main domains of well-being, these being cognitive, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And these are displayed in the image to the right, where we see Cross's worldview principles. And this image is actually based on indigenous oral histories that have captured patterns of human experience. And cognitive well-being refers to your psychological wellness as well as your mental health. And this can be affected by your identities, your relationship with your communities, as well as how you feel about your own self-esteem. Physical well-being refers to what you do for your physical wellness. So if you have access to food, access to water, access to housing. Spiritual well-being refers to doing things that allow you to center yourself and your community, whether that means practicing religion, practicing ceremony, meditating, etc. Emotional well-being is your ability to manage your emotions, such as stress and how you are feeling overall emotionally. And in order to achieve full well-being, it's imperative that neither of these domains get neglected. But it's also important to remember that that's very hard. It's really hard to balance all of these needs, especially in the society, the demanding society that we live in. So sometimes in order to fulfill your physical needs, such as provide yourself food, water, and housing, you might have to neglect another need, such as emotional needs, because of the fact that you might have to work and you might not have time to really dedicate towards fulfilling that emotional need. So while it is, that's the goal, to fulfill all of our needs, it's not always possible, but we need to remember that's not our own fault. It's just the way things work in this system, this society. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely just the absence of disease or infirmity. Many think of health to only be not being sick and doing healthy activities such as being physically active, eating nutritious meals. But while this does lead to good health, this is not all that health is. Achieving health is more than just working on your physical wellness, but instead also taking care of your mental health and making sure that that your well-being and your needs are being met. And we can already see how there are some connections between what we mentioned earlier about wellness and how that impacts your health overall. Being able to achieve good health should be a fundamental right. However, it's not treated as such. And there are various barriers that make it difficult for one to achieve this, some of them being financial barriers, housing barriers, transportation barriers, and we're going to get more into that in the next few sections. And overall, a person's health is determined by their circumstances and their environment. So again, going back to the idea that your health is not just what you eat, but also different factors around you. And you can kind of start to see that in the picture that I present on the right. So we see finances, housing, transportation, healthy eating, also medication, access to healthcare. And that is also what is known as the social determinants of health. This largely impacts what your health is in the long run. The social determinants of health are the conditions and places where people are born, live, learn, work, and play. This affects a wide range of health risks and health outcomes. And these are actually presented on the photo also to the right. So access to education, access to healthcare, and the quality of healthcare that you're receiving, the safety of your environment. So are you able to take a walk outside without fearing for your safety? Do you have access to quality food, quality nutritious food, or culturally appropriate foods? Stable housing, having access to transportation to access different resources. It also consists of community cohesion. So do you have social networks that are there to support you in any aspect? Employment and financial stability, and again, housing stability. So all these play into how your health is impacted in the long run. And what are basic needs? So basic needs are the minimal list of elements required to achieve wellness. It's important to note that this is not a full comprehensive list of all the basic needs. These are just the ones that we're going to talk about in this presentation. The first one being food. So access to healthy, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food. Access to transportation, having access to safe and reliable transportation, and housing. So having access to safe and affordable housing. So as I mentioned, this is not a full comprehensive list. This is only 3 basic needs that I was able to think of, but they are all very situational. So I want to pose a question to y'all. What are some needs that weren't on this slide that you would add? And you can go ahead and drop your answers in the chat. Make sure to set the chat to everyone so we can all see your lovely responses. I think for me, another need that I would love to talk about are sanitary resources or like menstruation products. I think these are definitely needs that a lot of people can't access because of financial barriers, and they should definitely be provided. Someone says medical needs for sure. I think there's a lot of barriers and towards access to medical care. And I definitely think that's something that should be provided as well. Medicine, for sure. Education, that's a big one. Yeah, healthcare for sure. Restrooms and showers. I heard that this is a lack of resources that has caused a rise in diseases for people who are houseless. For sure. Again, hygiene and care products. Thank you all for your responses. If you think of any more, feel free to drop them in the chat, but I'm gonna go ahead and move on. So now we're gonna talk a little bit about the importance of basic needs. So as I mentioned earlier, health and wellness is largely dependent on social determinants of health. And again, as a reminder, those are the conditions in which we live, work, and play. And I also included the picture again for your convenience. Unmet basic needs leads to worse health outcomes, and these health outcomes are disproportionate. They tend to impact Black, Indigenous, people of color at higher rates in comparison to white folks. And it's really important to meet your basic needs, because when you don't, it becomes a lot harder to focus on higher level tasks, such as performing in school or performing in work. And this is because you might be constantly distracted by the thought of finding safe and stable housing or the risks associated with that. Like that all takes time, that all takes energy as well. So it's like you kind of have to compensate one for the other. And finding ways to fulfill your basic needs takes time. As I mentioned, like if you're working a lot, if you have to work to like sustain yourself financially, you might not have time to meet other basic needs, or maybe even address other aspects of wellness that I mentioned earlier. So like cognitive wellness or spiritual wellness, because you have to focus on surviving. In addition, I want to talk about the importance of community care and just like community well-being. So fulfilling our basic needs is not only necessary for our survival, but the survival of the community. In the Blackfoot Nation's belief, self-actualization, which is our ability to reach our fullest potential, is the foundation under which community actualization is built. So in other words, being our best self is necessary for the community's ability to reach its fullest potential and be their best self. Blackfoot and other First Nations people see the work of meeting basic needs and creating safety as a community responsibility. So it's kind of like a cycle where we help meet each other's individual needs in order to meet the community's needs. Capitalism encourages individualization and to pull ourselves up from our own bootstraps, which basically means to try to better ourselves in this for the sake of advancing and being better than the person next to us. And this results in our basic needs being gatekept and commodified. And it also makes it very difficult to fulfill our cognitive needs, as I mentioned earlier, because we are constantly forced to give up our time and our energy to the workforce. And these differences are presented in this image where we see Maslow's hierarchy of needs under the Western perspective and the First Nations perspective that I just mentioned on the right side. And if y'all aren't familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's essentially a theory that suggests that humans are motivated to fulfill their most basic needs first. So things such as housing, food, clothing, safety, security. And then once those needs are met, then you can move on to fulfilling your other needs of love and self-esteem before finally being able to reach being your best self, so self-actualization. And in this model, you can see how it's literally a hierarchy, so you can't move on to fulfilling the next need until you fulfill the preceding one. And that raises the question of like how, like what happens to those who can't even get past the first level of meeting their basic needs, such as the ones I mentioned earlier, like housing, water. It makes it incredibly difficult to reach being their fullest best self. But on the other hand, in the First Nations perspective, they see things as a cycle. So instead of having us reach our fullest potential at the end, that actually is the foundation. This makes us interdependent on each other, as the community's well-being is a cycle with our well-being. So the community can only be well if we are well, and we can only be well if the community is well. So we're constantly giving back to each other. And now I'm gonna play this 1-minute video. It's called Rethinking Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. And essentially it's just gonna sum up everything that I just explained, and it's gonna go in a little deeper.
Island. While First Nations are different in many ways, their perspectives have significant philosophical overlap that's worth exploring. For one, many First Nations communities see self-actualization as something we are born as, not something we must spend our lives striving for. Self-actualization is not something we must work to earn, but something innate that we live out every day. Thus, children are treated with respect and dignity and are given the space to express who they are. As opposed to the individualistic culture that plagues capitalist society today, the Blackfoot and other First Nations peoples see the work of meeting basic needs, ensuring safety, and creating the conditions for the expression of purpose as a community responsibility. Community actualization allows all members to focus on their position in the web of relations that supports them all, a web of relations that includes the land they're a part of. When our lives are bound up in the lives of others, we learn generosity, trust, forgiveness, patience, kindness, and cooperation.
All right, so as was mentioned in the video, when we help each other fulfill our basic needs, we are then able to have more time for ourselves to pursue other things and other hobbies that we would not usually have time to do because we're so busy trying to survive. So now I would love to hear your thoughts and on what your needs are and on what you would like to do if you had more time. And again, I'm going to drop a link in the chat. It's going to be to a Jamboard. And if y'all aren't familiar with Jamboard, it's a website where you can edit on the side. So there's like sticky notes, you can add images or text, whatever you want. And please drop your thoughts or yeah, just the thoughts that you have on this question. I think if I had my needs met, like all my needs met, and I had more time or access, I think I would want to be able to craft more. I think that's something I really had to give up recently, just because I've been so focused on doing other things like going to school and working. So that's something that I wish I could do. Crochet, yes. I've actually been meaning to learn how to crochet, but because of time, I can't. Reading, yeah, I have a stack of books that I've been trying to read also. There's a lot of things that I've been trying to get to. Plant a garden. That is also one of my goals eventually, or to like start a compost bin as well. I've been meaning to get into that. All right, thank you all for your responses. All right, and now we're gonna move on to the impacts of unmet needs. So not meeting your needs means not being able to provide for your own or your dependents' basic needs due to insufficient income and or resources or time. And capitalism creates a society where it is very difficult to meet certain aspects of your needs because meeting these needs largely requires access to money, and it also requires access to transportation because resources may be out there for you, but because of the fact that they're far or like you might not have access to like a car or reliable public transportation, then it becomes really difficult to even access those needs. Examples of not meeting your needs means being food insecure or being housing insecure. Food insecurity is defined as the limited or uncertain access to adequate or healthy food. And as you can see on the image to the right of that, we see that there is income being funneled to other things such as rent and bills. Like majority of the income is being funneled to that. And because that is prioritized, we tend to leave food as the last priority. And because of that, a lot of people may skip out on meals, or they may instead try to save money and buy cheaper meals. And so this is known as food insecurity. This leads to food insecurity. And the movement to combat this is food justice. Food justice is a holistic view of the food system that addresses systemic barriers to accessing healthy and affordable food for all. Under capitalism, food isn't produced to feed people. Food is instead produced because people need to eat. And this makes selling food profitable. It creates a commodity over it, and it negates food as a human right. Food insecurity is not a result of food scarcity. So it's a common misconception that there's not enough food to go around, but there is. It's just that, like, do you have access and ability to pay for that? And that's why there is a competition for food. And it results, again, out of factors that are linked to capitalism. And it becomes harder to get access to healthy and nutritious food if you're tight on money, because these usually cost a lot more. So like if you're trying to get access to like organic vegetables, they will probably cost more. Food insecurity is also impacted by the location of resources. So do you have access to grocery stores, or food pantries or food distribution sites? So again, going back to the idea of like accessibility. According to Feeding America in the United States in 2019, 1 in 12 white individuals lived in a food insecure household, compared to 1 in 6 Latinx individuals, 1 in 5 Black individuals, and 1 in 4 Native American individuals. So as you can see, it becomes more prominent in the communities as we move down the line of this list. So food insecurity is experienced at higher rates among racial and ethnic minorities, and this is due to so many different factors, but most of them including structural racism and discrimination. Not having your food and nutritional needs met can lead to a lot of negative health outcomes, some of them being higher rates of mental health issues such as anxiety and depression, higher rates of hypertension and diabetes due to having to resort to buying high caloric, low cost food. And it can also lead to iron deficiency. And as you can see on the image to the right, there's a cycle that people tend to fall into. So being food insecure can lead to a development of unhealthy coping strategies, such as binge eating or skipping meals or buying cheap meals. They usually tend to be unhealthy in order to fill you up in that moment. And then this can lead to the development of having chronic disease. So if you're constantly eating unhealthy meals, it's more likely that you're going to develop a chronic disease. And when you do develop that, you have to seek out healthcare to manage that at health facilities such as hospitals or doctors' offices. And this usually means you have to take off time of work so that you can visit these facilities, or it might also mean that you have to pay out of pocket if you don't have health insurance. And so you will have to be spending more money and maybe working less. And that lowers the overall income that you have. And that goes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier. If you don't have enough income, some people usually tend to prioritize certain things like housing bills and such, so that they at least have stable housing, but at the expense of giving up food. And this leads into a perpetual cycle of stress and a perpetual cycle of food insecurity. Another example of not having your needs met is being housing insecure. Housing insecurity encompasses a variety of issues, including trouble paying rent, living in an overcrowded space, not having a stable house, spending majority of your income on housing and or couch surfing. Unaffordable housing leaves people with no choice but to rent substandard housing, and this is usually housing that is a lot cheaper, but it's at the expense of endangering people's lives and the safety of tenants because things may not be up to code. And cheaper housing options are often in unsafe, uncrowded, and in low-income neighborhoods. And I wanted to make that distinction because low-income neighborhoods can be a large disadvantage, as they are typically placed in places that are overcrowded, or they are in sites where there is heavy pollution, less access to certain resources such as healthy grocery stores, parks where you can work out, healthcare facilities where you can seek out management for diseases or just health issues. And it also has less adequate education. Most folks, about 88% of them experiencing houselessness and housing insecurity, are over the age of 24. So about 552,830 people are currently unhoused in the US, with Black, Indigenous, people of color experiencing it at the highest rates. And for those who do have housing, Low-income Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities experience living in substandard housing at higher rates. And living in substandard housing can include having water leaks, having poor ventilation, having pest infestations. And the graph on the right presents that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders experience houselessness at higher rates in comparison to other ethnic minorities. And this all has to do with something known as redlining. Redlining is the systemic denial of housing and services on a basis of race and class. Redlining essentially created maps where people could outline different cities and counties with different colors. And these colors are green, blue, yellow, and red. Green presented as the best place to live in and places that were worth investing in. Blue was seen as still desirable, yellow was seen as definitely declining, and red was hazardous. Red spaces were characterized as risky for investment, which is why a lot of redline places are deprived of resources that were mentioned earlier, such as parks, grocery stores, healthcare facilities, and they might have access to these resources, but because of the fact that they're underfunded and there's like less investment in those areas, it's likely that those resources are inadequate. So the map on the right actually is a map of San Diego. So La Jolla is up here where we see green and blue. It's outlined in green and blue, which signifies to the fact that it's worth investing in, as opposed to down here where we see more southern and central San Diego, it's outlined in red. And this map was actually created in 1934, so this is not anything recent, but you can see how the effects of this map mirror what we have today. So because there was a lot of investment going on in here, like northern San Diego, we see the university, we see UCSD built up here, as opposed to it being built down in the center of San Diego. And again, this all ties back into health and the fact that certain housing units may be more adequate as opposed to those people that are living in places that are not worth investing in, according to the map. Diving a little deeper into the relationship between housing insecurity and negative health outcomes. Housing insecurity can cause negative mental health problems, it can cause poor physical health, and it can cause limited access to healthcare and health insurance. Living in substandard housing can expose folks to mold, water leaks, lack of proper cooling/heating systems. It can expose people to bugs and lead poisoning. Lead poisoning can come as a result of bad or like inadequate infrastructure in like the water systems, and that can have long-term health effects. And this again all increases the risk of contracting infectious diseases and having worse health outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, transportation is a big factor in getting access to basic needs. It affects your ability to get from point A to point B, which is crucial to get access to various necessities. Unfortunately, our society is built to cater to those who have cars. Many folks don't have access to cars or have the financial means to pay for gas, to pay for car insurance, to pay for car payments. So because of this, they may rely on public transportation. But the problem is that public transportation may not always be timely. Like a 5-minute car drive could turn into like a 30 to 40-minute public transportation commute. And that also includes like walking in unsafe areas. So sometimes people might have to put their safety at risk in order to travel to certain places. And this affects people's ability to access resources that are necessary for our health, such as going to a grocery store or going to a park, being able to get transported to a recreational place or food distribution sites. So again, going back to the idea that resources may be out there, but the fact that transportation is difficult to come by makes it so that it's difficult for people to reap the benefits of those resources. And the movement to combat this is known as transportation justice. And this is the equal access of all people to the transportation that they need for a better quality of life, which makes streets and public spaces safer for pedestrians and bicyclists. And I went over a lot of information earlier. We talked about food insecurity, housing insecurity, and transportation insecurity. And I just want to emphasize that these insecurities have existed for a long time, and they were only exacerbated by COVID-19. COVID-19 exposed and worsened already existing inequalities, especially for those who were low income, Black, and Latinx individuals. COVID-19 caused a loss of jobs and a loss of hours, which led to a lower financial income, which made it very difficult for people to cover their bills, cover their rent, and pay for their food. In addition to this, they also experienced a fear of infection. This means a lot of people were staying inside their homes. For those who lived in substandard housing with mold, leaks, and poor ventilation, staying in these conditions all day, every day puts them at even higher risk of contracting a disease or a health condition. There was also a disruption in supply, which limited the resources available for people, such as food. During quarantine, everyone was stocking up on food and necessities, and those who had the financial means to stock up on these things were stocking up on these things. But those who didn't have the financial means to do that had to wait a lot longer because people were selling things out. For example, like toilet paper. That was something a lot of people were stocking up on. But because of that, other people who weren't able to get their hands on them had to wait, or even like water bottles. And if we turn our attention to the right, we can see that in this graph, which displays data on how many people were experiencing hardships during COVID-19, we can see that between the months of October 2020 and May 2020, there was a spike in people who were having difficulty covering their usual expenses. There was a lot of people who were not caught up on rent, a lot of people who were not having enough to eat. And this all has to do with the fact that finances were greatly impacted during COVID-19. All right, so that again, that was a lot of information that I just presented, but did you find anything surprising about any of the information? And feel free to drop your responses in the chat. I think for me, when I was doing this research, something that I found really surprising was the transportation justice. I think it just like, it made sense. It made everything make sense. Like these resources are available, but it's like difficult for people who don't have access to transportation to access those resources. And I think that's something that my family definitely faced, especially my mom, who wasn't able to drive until very recently. But yeah, I want to hear y'all's thoughts. Is there anything interesting? Someone says, at this point, knowing how America is, nothing is that surprising, just disappointing. That's very true. I agree. So now we're going to move on to the last section, which is community care. So clearly, as we mentioned, there's a lot of disparities that are present. A lot of people are not getting their basic needs met, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not the fault of the individual. This is the fault of the systems of oppression that are continuously working against them and making it difficult for them to access such resources. So how can we rely on these systems to fix these issues when they're the ones who created them in the first place? And that's why we're going to talk more about community care and how communities can care for each other instead of relying on these systems. Community care is defined as using our power, privilege, and resources to help the people who are both in and out of our scope of reach. This is essential for those who are not able to access basic resources such as healthcare or food. They also create strong social networks that have significant impacts on our health and well-being. And caring for your communities is a fight against the individualism that capitalism has promoted. So it's a direct contradiction to the pull yourself up by your own bootstrap ideology, which pushes people to work harder instead of asking for help. And an example of community care is mutual aid, and that's pictured up here. Mutual aid is an act of love. And we'll talk more about why that is here. Mutual aid is the practice of direct action, cooperation, mutual understanding, and solidarity. Mutual aid addresses survival needs while building understandings of the root causes of inequity. Mutual aid also disrupts the notion of the binary of giving and receiving. And this is because the giver doesn't necessarily expect to receive. And it also removes government hurdles, such as presenting proof of financial need or providing proof of residence, and taking away all the paperwork that may come with someone who is asking for help. Mutual aid can look like the redistribution of resources. It can look like redistributing food, redistributing funds, providing a place for someone to stay, offering to drive people to their destinations, picking up necessities for them. So it doesn't always have to entail like giving up like money or something. You can also provide mutual aid in other ways. Now I want to play this video. It's titled "Hundreds of Mutual Aid Groups Formed in Response to COVID-19. What Comes Next for Them?" And this is about 3 minutes long. And it's going to display like an example of how mutual aid can be impactful for people's health.
The new normal is pretty much doing as much deliveries as I can. It takes up a lot of time. It can be hours and hours, and you don't even realize how long it can take. But I mean, sometimes all day.
Is this kind of a new version of borrowing a cup of sugar?
Yes, it is a new version of borrowing a cup of sugar, but with people that we don't know.
So mutual aid on a basic level is when a group of people collectively pool their resources together to come to aid. It's not a one-off thing. It's not top down. It's a collective strategy of a community taking care of themselves.
Oh, there's Monica, and she's waiting with the shopping cart. Amazing. This is why I love Monica. She's like my absolute like favorite neighbor. Am I allowed to say that?
O sea, le agradezco mucho a ella porque me ayudó con mi diente. Hace un año me caí, tuve un accidente y si no hubiera sido por ella, mi diente estuviera.
You put it up from the front. You got it.
God bless you.
You're amazing.
How are you? Dora,
Good.
Sean, Mom, everybody.
They're good. Everyone's good. But I will see you soon again.
Okay,
Maybe we
thank
could like
you.
meet at the park or something when it's not so hot outside.
Okay, thank you.
I will text Jenny and then she'll like let
Okay,
you know.
thank you. Lily.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. So I dropped off a delivery for Monica back in like July, and she tried to donate $20 to me, and she said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any more money." And I said, "No, like donations are definitely just optional." And she said, "I had an accident, like my teeth is broken," and we were able to like fundraise the money to get her the surgery, and it happened to be on my birthday. So I got a picture on August 6th of Monica smiling, and it was like one of the best presents I've like ever gotten. So I think it's just really important that people understand that like mutual aid like is for everyone, regardless of whether you're like giving and receiving or just giving or just receiving, you know.
You often see the rise of like mutual aid groups in times of crisis, but having studied these groups from before, I know that this strategy is one that groups have been using even when there isn't a crisis, just to take care of themselves and to be able to flourish in this American society.
All right. So this video was really important in showcasing how mutual aid can work to take care of the community, and in this case, helping Monica fund a treatment for her tooth. If she, in the case that she wasn't able to get funding through mutual aid, it's very possible that she would have neglected this, and it would have most likely gotten like really severe and like probably caused other health issues. So here we can see how mutual aid ties back into well-being and health. Something that's really important in this work is thinking of community-driven solutions. A community-driven approach aims to empower people by putting the power back into their hands. Community-driven solutions are community-based and community-led. They center the needs and perspectives of those in the community, and they uplift and give the community a platform instead of speaking over them and assuming what's best for them. I think a lot of people have good intentions when doing community work, but sometimes they step in and assume that they know what's best for the community and instead give them solutions that they probably don't need, and they need other things addressed. So the main thing in community-driven solutions is really listening to them and uplifting their needs. And community-driven solutions also encourage social networking and encourage community building. So going back to the idea of creating social networks and having someone who you can rely on and having someone who can support you not only financially, but emotionally and in other aspects as well. And I also want to play this other video. It's titled Mutual Aid Neighbors Helping Neighbors in Need. It's about 3 minutes long, and it's gonna display the importance of listening to community and really centering their needs.
In 2017, 2 Jersey City Episcopal churches launched a food pantry with the goal of helping an underserved neighborhood. 4 years and 1 pandemic later, and the need has doubled, according to Triangle Park Community Center Director Monica Shaw.
Last year, before the pandemic, we would service about 400 people a month. Now we service 800 to 1,000 a month.
So if someone could just come right by.
Somebody comes right by, they can get a book,
take a jacket.
They can come and get a jacket or
And
get
then
some
there's
clothing.
food inside.
And then there's food inside. So we offer them something hot to drink.
But there's something this Jersey City resident says has always been missing when it comes to donations.
A lot of people have well intentions, and then they come up with their brainstorm of what they think that the community need without taking into account that they should really ask the community. In order to make an impact, you have to ask the constituents.
This is much more having a conversation.
In January, artist Amy Wilson started the Jersey City Mutual Aid Society.
Mutual aid is really the most basic way I can describe it is it's like neighbors helping neighbors.
Wilson describes it as a non-hierarchical way of giving.
Instead of us being like, hey, you need this, like we're going to give you this, we're going to these groups and saying like, what are you hearing from your community? And it's also, I think, really done with the understanding that we could all be in that situation someday. There's no kind of looking at giving like, I know better.
During conversations with 5 organizations she works with closely, Wilson says she discovered holes in the system, especially when it comes to items like diapers.
There are no federal programs that pay for diapers. There are no state or city programs that pay for diapers. So it's this huge gap, and it's sort of like nobody ever reached out and asked the people in need, you know, what do you need? We just sort of made this decision.
To hear Amy post that the assistance programs don't cover such necessities breaks my heart. And at that point, that's when you say, I can't sit here and just be sad about it.
With the need growing, Jersey City resident Debbie Schwartz tapped into her dog play group, asking friends with kids if they had baby clothes and items to donate. She brought those directly to Triangle Park, which has a giveaway for moms once a week.
Anything they need to let me know, and I'll find it.
There's a total of 14 volunteers, Amy Wilson says, now helping with the website, item collecting, or making delivery runs to places like this fridge, filled with free items created by community members for community members.
If there's anything that the last year has taught us, is to just be there for one another.
Monica Shaw says Jersey City Mutual Aid Society is allowing her to expand their services at a time when those services are most in need. I'm Leah Mishkin for NJ Spotlight News.
So as was highlighted in that video, we really need to center the needs of the community, because if you don't, you might be providing like other resources that they might not even need. So again, going back to the idea of really just uplifting their voices. And now I want to talk about some local community-driven solutions that are existing here in San Diego. First one being the Community Front. The Community Front is a mutual aid group that distributes free clothing and free food to anyone who wants or needs it. They collect and distribute clothing, home decor, toys, and other goods in a free store format. This is actually pictured here on the right. So you can see it's like a little pop-up shop. This is like done with the purpose of humanizing the experience of asking for help and like utilizing these resources. I think there's like a big stigma around asking for help and visiting these distribution places, but the Community Front really strives to make it, I guess, like as normal as possible. And this is also pictured down here where they also distribute warm foods as well. They also distribute care packages that typically include water bottles, masks, period products, wipes, toothbrushes, and shampoo and conditioner. And if you want to check them out, their Instagram handle is at the Community Front, but their page is also going to be linked in the resources page that I'll provide for y'all in just a little bit. Another one being We All We Got SD. We All We Got was started by local activists in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They focus on providing food to those who need it. They operate outside of the Brown Building in City Heights. I tagged the location down here. It's also linked in the resources page if you want to check that out. They accept food donations, they organize and pack bags, and they distribute them at weekly food pickups. And for those who aren't able to make the pickups or aren't able to drive up and do that, they also offer grocery deliveries. And it's a pretty simple process. Like you really just have to email them or text them and they can like set something up. And the main thing is that they don't ask any questions and there are no prerequisites. So again, as I mentioned earlier, mutual aid really takes away that barrier of hurdles, like government hurdles. So like providing proof of like financial need or something. And another resource for you all on campus is the Hub Basic Needs Center. They're located at the original Muir Student Center in Building A, room E100, right in between Muir and Revelle. They help support students with financial resources, housing resources, and food security. During the COVID pandemic, they were giving out various grants, and they have also helped with housing people temporarily. They also have free food distributions on Wednesdays from 4 to 6 at the Hub if you want to check that out. Here's the QR code if you want to find more information on the Hub. Their page and everything will also be linked in the next slide. So here's a list of resources. If you type in this tiny URL or scan this QR code, you'll be taken to a page where I linked all the documents that I used to curate this presentation today, as well as all the resources that I just mentioned on the community-driven solutions that are happening here in San Diego. But yeah, feel free to take a screenshot or take a picture if you want to access those resources. But with that, I end off this presentation. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for your engagement. If you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or email us at cccenter@ucsd.edu or visit our website at ccc.ucsd.edu. But yeah, thank you all so much. Also, the QR code here is linked. It links you to our social medias and stuff. So if you want to follow us on Instagram, check out our YouTube, that will be linked there as well. Yeah, thank you all for joining.